Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us, Maven Money Talks podcasts. And today we're going to be going over Financial Planning 101. And I know that doesn't get a lot of people too excited, but you've got two guys here who it does get very excited. And so we want to make sure and give you some actionable ideas that you can take through and implement and again, add value, give you something to go back home and work on within your own financial household.
Yeah, and talking about your financial household, we kind of pivot the conversation a little, not necessarily just from financial planning, and kind of make it more of a lifestyle planning conversation, because that really is encompassing your entire life. And at the end of the day, you can financial plan all day long, but if you aren't living the life that you ultimately want to live for that financial plan, it doesn't really make any sense. There's no point in that. So
definitely. One of the big things that we've adjusted in working with clients over the last couple of years, especially since COVID, and I think this obviously COVID impacted everybody in the sense that you realized what was important. And I think balancing life is much more important to people and in having a more enjoyable lifestyle. And so again, that's really what we try to work on with clients is obviously financially we need to look and see how things are working well together, but really understanding what are your goals, what are you looking to achieve, and how do you enjoy the ride along the way, right? So that's equally as important.
Yeah, and also just making sure that you know how to access the knowledge, the guidance, educating yourself on what that plan is going to look like, how to create that plan, and just knowing where to find resources, which would be us.
Yep, cool. Where do we want to start?
I think we could probably start with chatting about cash flow or budgeting.
Okay.
Because let's start with a low note because everyone hates the word budgeting. So we'll start with that and then we'll build up from there.
Perfect.
But one of the things we talk to every client, every prospect, everybody that we talk to, kind of the bedrock of building a financial plan is figuring out your cash flow, right? And one of the things that you have to really think about is not only what funds are going into the equation, but also what funds are going out of the equation, right? So that's why we don't just say budgeting, like knowing what your income looks like. We call it cash flow because you want to both know what income looks like and what your expenses look like and figuring out what that free cash flow balance is.
Right. So if you're single, it might be a little bit easier to go through because you're the only one spending. If you're married and you've got kids, then that can be a little more challenging. One exercise that we go through and that we recommend clients going through is taking a look at 2 or 3 months of your bank account statements and going through line by line and accounting for every expense that's on there. If you've got credit cards, take a look at your credit card statements as well. And this will probably help you clean up some of your streaming habits because my wife and I, we went through this, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. We're financial advisors, so we go through this every so often within our own household. We were realizing there's different apps that we were paying for that we don't use at all. And those little things can add up to be $5, $10, $50 a month that you're not getting any value out of. So going through line by line is extremely important. And again, if you're married or you've got a partner, then that's something that you guys should be doing together. Have a cocktail, grab a glass of wine, make it an evening activity and chat through it. And so that'll give you a really good idea of not only, again, what's coming in, but more importantly, what's going out. And I think in that conversation and through that activity, you can help start to decide some of your goals and start to define what are some of your values. For us personally, we will spend more money for gym memberships and things that keep us healthy as opposed to necessarily eating out, where other people may say, hey, we really want to enjoy some good cuisine and some nice restaurants, so they prefer to eat out over something else. So going over what do you value, where do you want to spend your money, this is a great exercise to start to hone in on that and seeing where is your money going that you don't care about and that you can start to maybe refine, control a little bit better.
Totally. And we talk about this a lot. So you're talking about, it holds true for whether it's debt or whether it's cash flow. There's good debt and there's bad debt. And there's good cash flow, good expenses and bad expenses, right? Good debt is something that's going to like benefit your life. If you're like buying a home, you're getting a new car that's going to get you to a new job, paying for higher education, things like that are going to be able to advance you in your career. Same thing with cash flows. Like if you're doing things that are going to make you feel better or things like that versus, hey, I'm spending a bunch of money on coffees out that are $8 a piece versus making coffee at home or, you know, eating out all the time when I can make food at home, things like that. It's just important to understand pulling those bank statements is very telling because it's very easy to get into a routine of money flying out just on the normal stuff that you expend. When you really look at it, it's a little bit, you take a step back and you're like, oh man, that's a lot of money going to XYZ expenses that maybe I should adjust or rein in a little bit, stuff like that. So it's a really good exercise. And the reason we say 2 to 3 months is because life happens. There's always going to be outliers in those things. If you just pull 1 month of bank statements and your engine blew up in your car and you had to have a huge expense, that's not a realistic estimate of what your monthly expenses are going to look like. So that's why we always tell people to do 2, 3. If you can do more power to you. But 3 months is usually a good representation of what like expected expenses might look like, kind of averaging those things out.
Yeah, definitely. So once you've gone through, you've looked at what you're spending, how much income you have coming in, that's a really good time to start creating a realistic budget. So maybe you've got a good understanding of where the cash flow is going, and then start to rein in on, okay, really, where do we want to continue spending, and where can we cut back to start achieving our goals? So that's really the very first process of financial planning and kind of getting your financials in order. And again, a lot of that's going to just come down to what are your goals, what are your values, and making sure that aligns with your finances.
Yeah, and we always talk about like you have your income, and then you have your income, and then you have your expenses, and then that little extra part is your free cash flow, right? Mm-hmm. And so once you create a budget and you realize what your free cash flow looks like, your net income, which is your net income obviously because taxes are already accounted for, so you don't really use those for any other goals, but once you figure out what that free cash flow looks like, then what number you really have to then translate to other goals that you're going to create in your life, right? Because creating a budget and stuff, that's bedrock, but we're doing that because we're then going to build on that for creating different goals and different things for doing that lifestyle planning that we talked about.
Right. And a lot of that, so it can come down to short-term goals and long-term goals. So when we're looking at short-term goals, we're talking about maybe saving for a vacation. You've got kid's birthday party coming up. You've got, for this year, my spouse, Danya's turning 40. So we've got a big trip planned, budgeting for things like that. And so there's short-term things, and then there's long-term goals that you also want to account for. And just like we kind of started this whole conversation, it's always a balancing act. And so we want to make sure that you're enjoying the ride along the way. And we think that's very important to continue to keep that lifestyle, so that way you're feeling accomplished as you're going through and completing these things.
I sometimes equate it to like dieting. So no one likes to create a diet that's so strict that you're miserable all the time and you don't want to stick to it. That's how diets fail. Everyone talks about that. But it's kind of the same thing for creating your goals and creating your budget. Like, you don't want to create a budget that doesn't allow you to enjoy your life or do the things that you want to do. Like Paolo said, it's all about balance. So being able to create manageable goals and things that you can incrementally achieve over time versus like, hey, I'm cold turkey changing my entire life today. That may or may not be realistic for you, but for most people, that's not as realistic. Creating small baby step goals is what I always recommend, just to make sure that they're achievable, but also measurable. So we always talk about, it's very easy to be like, I want to start spending less, right? But it's like, okay, it's really hard to know if you really are versus like pulling your statements every month, whatever. So if you say like, hey, I want to limit my spending on eating out to $200 a month, right? That's a manageable thing that you can keep an eye on, that you'll know, you know, what you're spending on a monthly basis, especially if you keep an eye on it and focus on that. So not only making goals that are manageable, but goals that are measurable to be able to appropriately manage the budget.
Definitely.
So one thing that's also really important to talk about too is making sure you revisit your goals. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the kind of set it and forget it idea. So financial goals don't work that way, as you could probably imagine. So just making sure that attainable, measurable, but also reviewable goals. So everyone's different. I don't recommend reviewing your financial goals every week, but if you're doing it every 6 months to a year, life changes. Your goals might change. Maybe you have a baby, maybe you change your job, maybe someone in your family retires and there's a windfall of funds. Like there's a lot of things that can change. We always recommend it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. Your life's gonna evolve, so your goals have to evolve with your life too.
Definitely. And as you go through and you revisit things, like you can use that as an opportunity to reward yourself if you did really well, right? So again, something that makes this more of an enjoyable experience, as opposed to thinking, hey, I'm just trying to cut everything off and save as much as possible. Again, being realistic and rewarding yourself for going through this. And as you start to make progress, again, it's just the first 5 minutes of the morning, to get up early for a workout are the hardest, but once you're up, once you're put your shoes on, you're moving to the gym, you're in the gym, you're working out, everything feels a whole lot better. And afterwards it feels great, but it's the hardest to get started. So once you get started, make sure that you're starting with something that will give you that progress, and then it will continue on, again, assuming you go through and revisit and adjust. So
yeah, and one thing that we always kind of transition to from there is like, hey, we're going to start creating these goals and building progress toward financial planning. But one thing that we always talk about is managing debt appropriately, whether it's people have mortgages, people have consumer debt through credit cards, people have car loans, people have student debt. There's all different kinds of debt that people are managing across the board. So being able to manage that debt appropriately is super important for creating the healthy financial planning and lifestyle planning picture. Because like I mentioned earlier, there's good debt and there is bad debt, right? And every different kind of debt comes with a different interest rate on it and a different kind of burden on you for your cash flows. So it's really important to have an eye and understand what different categories of debt you have, but also what the burden on your cash flow is associated with each of those cash flows, right? So maybe you've got a car loan that's 4%. Right? And then maybe you've got your mortgage that's 5%. And then maybe you've got student debt that's 8%. And then maybe you've got some consumer debt, credit card debt that might be 22%, right? So there is an efficient and an inefficient way to manage that debt and pay down toward those goals, as we know. So instead of spinning your wheels, it's not a fun activity, but putting it down on paper, knowing what those interest rates are and knowing what they're doing to your cash flow is super important, because again, there's efficient, inefficient ways, there's different strategies that you can use to pay down and manage those debts.
Yeah. And actually, before we go into debt really quick, because I think this is a really good thing to consider, is you always hear about an emergency fund. And so you want to have an emergency fund. So ideally, you don't have to get to the credit cards, right? But let's say, for example, you've got credit card debt, you're starting to budget, you're starting to save, and you always hear about emergency funds. And so sometimes where I see people having a little more, it's definitely more of a mind game in their savings accounts that's earning 0.001% interest, so that they have that savings there, but then they've got credit card debt that's 20-25% interest, and that's money just going to the bank. So you're really paying the bank in two places by not handling some of that credit card debt. So it's all a balancing act, and I think that finding out what number is good to keep in savings, but sometimes you may have to keep savings thin to pay off that debt, because that's a better decision for you. Obviously, you know your situation the best. If there's something at work coming up where maybe, the company is not doing well or things like that, yeah, maybe it's a better time to keep a little bit more in savings as a buffer. But there's also times to consider, well, hey, we should be working harder on this debt than trying to create this large buffer, because at the end of the day, you can always go back to those credit cards in a worst case scenario. Again, that's not something that we want people to do, but you've got to be and have your money working for you as effectively as possible is my opinion. And that's something that I think a lot of people may overlook, is keeping that savings buffer and still retaining debt and not handling that. And again, you're just throwing money away at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So I mentioned the rates that are on debt that you have, but you've also got to pay attention to the rates that you're getting paid on things too, kind of on both sides of it, both coming in and out. So that's a really good point.
So sorry, we'll go back to managing credit and debt more appropriately. And so we've got a few good habits that you can really develop to make sure that, again, things are working in your benefit. So obviously one of them, review your statements regularly. So we already talked about that. So keep track of your purchases and make sure you know what's going on. Pay your bill on time. Obviously, again, you're paying interest already, but if you're paying late fee charges, then that's something that is just money being tossed away as well.
Yeah, one of the primary factors that the credit bureaus look at for your credit score overall is on-time payments. It's a significant factor in fluctuation of your score, so you always want to make sure and at least pay your minimum payment to make sure that you don't have a negative hit on your credit score.
And if you incur a fee such as an overdraft fee, a banking fee, or something like that, don't be afraid to call the bank and just ask, hey, can I have this waived? This is, again, money just that's being tossed away from you, money that you're just throwing away essentially. Pick up the phone, call and just ask, right? It never hurts to ask. You'd be surprised. Maybe you catch somebody on a great day and they'll say, yeah, okay, sorry. But if this happens over and over, then I would think that they may not do that. But anytime that you can, again, keep your money working for you more effectively, I think that's great. Paying off your balance every month to avoid interest, obviously that's best case scenario.
And a caveat on that, so a lot of people that haven't used credit often think that you have to pay off your balance every single month, right? So if my card starts at 0 and I spend $200 on that credit card in the month, a lot of times people think they have to pay off that $200 before it registers at the end of the month. So you don't want to do that, because what that's doing is not building your credit. So you have to register that amount on your statement and then pay it off immediately after that, because what that tells the bank is that you're actually responsibly using your credit. So that's how you build your credit score. If you pay it off before it registers on your statement, to the bank on paper, it looks like you never used your credit card at all. That's the same as using a debit card, right? So what you want to make sure is you can use your credit, but just make sure you're using your credit responsibly to avoid interest payments. So let that balance register on your statement. There's going to be a current balance and there's going to be a statement balance. So you always want your statement balance as much as possible to stay 0, right? Because that's what's going to be interest payments based off of that. That's what's going to help build your credit score.
Yeah. So speaking of credit cards, take advantage of the rewards programs. I mean, there's so many great rewards programs out there. So again, this comes down to part of what are your values and goals. So if you want to be traveling more, then finding a card that gives you the most reward points based on, travel, then look for that. If you enjoy eating out at nice restaurants, find one that provide more points for eating out. There's cards for hotels. There's all types of cards out there, cash back rewards. So maybe none of those really apply to you, and just getting some cash back is helpful. So take advantage of those programs. But again, make sure that you're following those first 3 habits before going into that, because that'll help make sure that you don't start paying interest on those reward points.
Yeah, and then just keep an eye on your credit score too, right? So it's hard, unless you're renting a new place or buying a place, most people don't pull their credit or have an idea what's going on with their credit score. Yep. So we always encourage people to sign up for some kind of a credit monitoring service. There's a lot of free ones out there now. So there's Credit Karma, there's Experian, there's a lot of different bureaus have these credit monitoring, and it can give you a month-to-month snapshot of what you're doing and how it's affecting your overall credit score, right? So if you've got a goal a year from now of maybe buying a house or buying a new car or whatever, and your credit score is going to have a significant effect on that rate that you're getting on that mortgage or that car loan,
right?
It's a really good use of your time and effort to try to attack that credit score and get it as high as possible, so that way you get the most favorable rates, right? So just having an eye on those things. We always recommend downloading some kind of an app to help you with visibility, because it's one thing to be able to pull your bank statements and stuff like that, but a lot of times you don't think about the fact that hey, I need to keep an eye on this credit score, because it affects so many other things, ripple effect on different funds that I have access to for other goals in my life.
Right. Well, this actually leads into our final 5th great habit to build, which is protecting yourself from credit card fraud. So when you go through and actually look at one of these free sites, they'll email you and just say, hey, we've seen an update on this. We've seen an update on your credit card balance going down, or your credit card balance going up, or your credit was run for this. So you will get notifications, and if something comes up, then you're able to act on it and say, hey, this was fraudulent activity. Go through, freeze your account, so that way more fraudulent activity can't happen, and start working on that, because the last thing you want is identity theft and your credit to be ruined just because it's something that you hadn't thought of or weren't monitoring. So,
and then the last thing, kind of along those similar lines for improving your credit score over time, is just try to automate stuff. We do auto pay for most things, most people do nowadays, but that's one way that you can really help yourself avoid late payments, is setting up those automatic monthly payments to help attack that debt. Because again, amount of credit that you have outstanding is a big factor in your credit score. Late payments is another really big factor in your credit score. So the more you can avoid those late payments on your credit score, the better off you're going to be.
Definitely. Any other things you want to cover on the credit or debt side?
Nope, I think we can move on.
All right. Well, let's talk about becoming an investor.
Okay.
How about that? So when to take the plunge? When do you think is a good time for people to start investing?
Everyone's situation is different,
Right.
obviously. We've kind of alluded to a lot of those things. It depends on your cash flow, it depends on outstanding debt, depends on a lot of things that you have managed, because as we know, there's no way to guarantee a rate that you're going to get if you're investing in the stock market, things like that. There's going to be volatility and things like that. One thing that you know for sure is the rate that you're paying on an outstanding credit card, right? So if you have a credit card that's got a 22%, interest rate that you're paying on it, it's, most of the time pretty much always going to be the case is you attack that first before you decide to take the plunge into an investment perspective, because the odds are that you're going to be able to guarantee a 22% return to do better than what's going out the door for that credit card is very low.
Yep. So when to invest? I think there's a couple good times when, after you've looked through your cash flow, you've looked at there's leftovers, right? So you've got extra cash flow.
That's that free cash flow I was telling you.
So maybe you've decided, hey, we're canceling these apps, these streaming services. Now we've got an additional $50, $100, or you've just been spending a lot of money going out and you've got a lot more than you really need to cover your basic expenses. That's when you should start thinking about having your money work for you harder. And I think sometimes the only real motivation is to look at your savings account and your checking account and see how much the bank is paying you. Because if you're looking at that, you can be earning interest, especially right now. It's, we've got a high interest rate environment. There's money market, high yield savings accounts that are paying much better interest than a typical checking or savings account. So there's a lot of options that can be there for you. But ultimately, investing is going to be dependent on what your goals are, when you need that money, and that's going to help dictate what type of vehicles to consider and use.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, you can kind of think of it as like a 3-step process, right? Like, first step is take care of managing debt that's outstanding, right? That's going to, especially high interest bearing debt. Like, you can invest while you've got a mortgage, right? Because mortgages are typically a lower rate depending on your situation, but tackling that high interest bearing debt is really important. And then making sure, we talked about it already, the emergency fund component, right? So once the debt is done, really attacking that emergency fund component, because what you don't want to do is pay off your debt and then have an emergency, and then you're right back into relying on said credit card debt to be able to address that. So second step is really address that emergency fund component. And after that's all done and you feel like you're in a good spot based on your cash flows, boom, you can look at the investment, taking a dive into it.
Yep, exactly. So what types of investments do people typically get started with?
Again, it depends. So a lot of this is going to be, that's why we talk about this as lifestyle planning, right? Is that no two people are going to have the same financial plan. No people are going to have the same lifestyle planning. So it really depends on a lot of different factors. A couple of the main ones are risk tolerance and your time horizon, right?
Yeah, I think, but typically the most common, what people think of are stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, are typically, when you think about investing, right? Those are kind of the main vehicles that you would consider getting started with. And again, there's really no reason for anyone not to get started, because every one of those options has an option for a different, level of investor. So meaning how much you're willing to invest and the level of risk you're looking to take. There's options out there. So I guess, do we want to talk a little bit about the different investments, or do we want to push on to more of looking through, proper diversification?
I think maybe a place to start kind of in that trend, like following the like progression of going from the paying off debt to the emergency fund to the investment component. So the first thing that I always tell people to look for is, hey, are you currently working? And do you have a workplace retirement plan, right? So really the first thing that you want to look for is a great return on your investment. And the best place to find that is through a company match in your workplace retirement plan, through your company's 401k, right? So if you're putting in 3% and your company is matching you 3%, that's an immediate 100% return on your money, and that is not available anywhere in the market. So we always coach people, know what's available to you through benefits, through your benefit package, through your work. And if you do have an amazing opportunity, like a company match, safe harbor match, things like that, absolutely take advantage of those first and foremost. Once those are exhausted, then you get a little more strategic on looking at different opportunities and things where you're going to invest, on your own, or maybe you're like, hey, it's easier for me to just keep investing additional funds through my workplace retirement plan. It's easy. It comes directly out of my paycheck. I'm the kind of person that just, if I can auto pay it, auto pay. And so, and they call that dollar cost averaging, to where you're taking the same amount out of your check every single paycheck, it helps you not think about it as much.
Right.
So it kind of turns the lever off of the emotion in, taking money out of my checking account and putting it into my retirement plan or things like that and investing. Anytime that you can remove some of the emotion from the investing, it can be very helpful because there's going to be volatility and there's going to be ups and downs in the market. And so I'm a big proponent of accessing workplace retirement plans.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Take advantage of it. Think about it too. You've got tax saving opportunities there. You've got, most plans now have Roth accounts. So if you're high income and you don't qualify for a Roth, then you can put money away in a Roth there. So there's a lot of tax advantages that are available. And, again, you're trying to keep more money in your pocket as opposed to paying in taxes. A retirement plan is a good place to start with that.
I think that's a really good point from the high income earner, a Roth component on 401ks. So a lot of you are probably familiar with there's income restrictions on Roth IRAs, which is the investment where you fund it with post-tax dollars, and then the growth within the account is tax-free when you take it out. So really great opportunity, especially if you're investing for a long time. But the nice thing that came about relatively recently is that the Roth component of 401ks are a lot more popular now, and those do not have any income restrictions. So the great thing about it is high income earners that previously didn't have a tax-free growth Roth-like vehicle available to them now have it easily available through a workplace retirement plan. So.
And let's go back to where we started this whole thing, balance, right? So it doesn't have to be completely one or the other. For most high income earners, guess what? They need that tax savings. So you can use pre-tax, but you can also take advantage of the Roth. And you can change these things most typically in all plans, at any point in time too. So it's a balancing act. And this is where we spend time sitting down with folks to help them understand their tax situation better. We'll sit down with their CPA, their accountant, to make sure, hey, let's really find what a good balancing percentage is between the two. Because the other thing, most people default into the traditional, and not everybody gets the same tax benefit by saving those pre-tax dollars. If you're in a lower tax bracket, you're having to put more money into it really to give it as much of a tax savings because your percentage is lower. What you're paying in taxes is lower. Whereas a high income earner, they're going to save more by utilizing those plans. So really having a good understanding of your tax situation will help indicate, hey, am I getting as much tax benefit utilizing this? And that's a great conversation to have with your CPA, accountant, tax preparer, and running those numbers and just seeing what are you really saving and utilizing that, because maybe it may make sense to put more into a Roth because you're not saving that much, and then that money is going to grow for you tax-free over 35 years, and that becomes a much larger tax-free number compared to what you saved in taxes today. So
yeah, and something that we try to talk to most of our clients about too is tax distribution strategy in retirement, right? So everybody thinks about like, hey, I get to retirement and everything is just way easier. Like there's still taxes that you're paying in retirement. A lot of people don't think about that. So Social Security, a component of that can be taxed 50 or 85% depending on your income. So what we really preach is you want to make sure that once you get into retirement, you can do that tax efficient strategy, right? So if I'm taking out of my pre-tax dollars and I'm getting taxed on every dollar I'm taking out in retirement, and I'm getting very close to the next tax bracket, I want to have that tax-free Roth bucket that I can then rely on toward the end of the year to avoid paying an extra 2, 5, 7% tax on those dollars. So if you don't have that tax-free bucket, your hands are kind of tied. You can't really be strategic in that distribution strategy in retirement. So it's important to make sure that you set yourself up for success so you're not just kind of stuck with is what it is, paying taxes in retirement. So you can sit down with your financial professional and work out a better strategy to manage the tax in retirement.
Yeah, definitely. This is something obviously we illustrate and go through and see what makes the most sense, and we can clearly show, hey, if we do this amount is going to be more beneficial for you. Or maybe I've actually seen it in some scenarios where depending on where people are at in life and what their account values are, maybe it doesn't make as much of a difference, but it's better to illustrate it, think through it, as opposed to just making a, uninformed decision, I guess.
Yeah,
So
important thing is knowing your options.
Right,
and walking through it, because you can't create a strategy if you don't know what all your options are. So we just try to make sure people are aware of what levers they have to pull, and those levers are different if you're an employee, if you're self-employed, if you're a business owner. And we have other videos where we've talked about some of those different strategies and stuff too. But yeah, just talking to your financial professional about your situation and making sure you understand what strategies you have available to you to make sure that you're saving for your retirement in the most efficient way possible.
Yep, definitely. And I think where this actually comes into play a lot is for people that want to retire earlier too. So again, having more control over taxes and having other options out there, really important. So definitely something to consider. together. And yeah, I think that's a really good
I got
point.
us off on a big tangent there, but I think now we can jump into types of investments and kind of what things. We kind of went on a tangent there on different kinds of retirement plan strategies, but I think we can now jump into different types of investments that might be available to someone if if they're just starting to take the plunge into investing.
Sure.
So I think the first one that everyone probably hears about are stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. Right. And ETFs may be a little bit less known because they're exchange traded funds. They pretty much work like a mutual fund, but a little bit different for for those of you who haven't heard about them. But those are generally, I think, what people would mostly think about when they're talking about their first dipping their toe into investing.
Definitely. Yeah. Obviously, stocks, you have ownership within a company. You're going to see your investment go up when the company's performing well, has stronger earnings, stronger profits. Vice versa, we're going through a hard economic time. The company is performing poorly. You're going to see your investment decline. So you have basically invested in just a single company. Where with a mutual fund is going to give you, think of it as like a basket of investments, right? So maybe it gives you access to 100 to 250, maybe even 300 companies to diversify your investment. So if you're investing $100, you're not going to be able to afford, too many stocks, individual stocks with $100, but you can put your money into a mutual fund, be well diversified, and still invested in the market.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. A lot of people that are just starting out their investment journey typically start with investing in mutual funds. Kind of, to Paolo's point, it allows you to get better diversification with that $100 than you would ever be able to get with, because there's single shares of companies that are in the thousands of dollars, right? So to be able to start your investing journey, you don't want to sacrifice the diversification component. So it's a really good idea to look at mutual fund and ETF opportunities that are kind of those fractional shares of companies. And then the other side of it is debt instruments, fixed income, which is bonds, right? And so in that situation, you're essentially giving your money to an institution, whether it's a corporation or a municipality or whatever it might be, and they're paying you an interest rate for essentially loaning them your money, right? That's why they call it fixed income, because they're paying you a fixed rate. There's variable rates and things like that too, but that's a little bit into the weeds. But yeah, that's essentially you're loaning your money out to somebody. Similarly to when you have your money at the bank, right? We talked about that savings account paying you 0.01%, right? So you have your money sitting at the bank and they're paying you that 0.01% to house your money at the bank, right? Similar idea for bonds and bond mutual funds is you're giving your money, loaning it to whatever the institution is, and they're paying you an interest rate essentially to house your funds there.
Exactly. And ETFs can be, an ETF of stocks or bonds, but one of the main benefits of an ETF compared to a mutual fund is typically they're very low cost and they're more tax efficient. So those are the two key differences when you're looking at an ETF to a mutual fund. They could be very, very similar in what they're invested in, but the tax consequences and the internal expenses may be very, very different. So for a lot of taxable accounts, we'll utilize more ETFs in those accounts because it's more tax efficient, whereas in maybe an IRA or 401k, you're typically going to see mutual funds.
And then I think the last category that people that are just starting their investment journey would probably be familiar with is cash equivalents. And what that really is, Paolo alluded to, like the savings account that you have at the bank where you're getting the 0.01%. There's other cash equivalent vehicles like money market accounts, which is like a cash focused like savings account mutual fund essentially, right? Where they're paying you as a higher rate for housing your funds in the mutual fund than the bank is paying you typically in a savings account. There's CDs, there's treasury bills, there's all different things. The idea behind cash equivalents is you're looking for an opportunity to achieve a higher rate of return on a cash-like vehicle than you are getting with other cash-like vehicles while having a similar risk profile.
Right.
Exactly. And then I think, to bring it all in, kind of full circle on why they have those all different opportunities for investment choices that you can make is those are all going to have a different risk profile, a different expected return, different volatility with the market. They're going to have different risk factors that affect, how that stock or that holding moves, right? So just making sure that we have a good understanding of what our goals are is going to help us decide what holdings we have in the portfolio.
And time horizon. How much time do we have to achieve these goals? If you're buying a house in a year, probably don't want that money going in the stock market. You probably want it in something that's relatively, conservative, maybe earns a higher bit interest, but is also more liquid. So that's where cash equivalents may be a better option compared to, hey, I'm planning for retirement, I'm 25 years old. Well, then stocks are going to be more appropriate for you.
Yeah, it's really easy to get into a swing for the fences mentality sometimes, because you're like, oh, the stock market's really hot. Like, I really want to get my money in, but you need to, it's important to take a breath and take a step back,
right,
and make sure that you have a good view on what your goals are, because the stock market can be very fickle, right?
Yep.
So we've seen it in the last 5 years. A lot has gone on where there's been dramatic ups and dramatic downs. Just because the market is on a great upswing at any given time, if you need X dollars for a down payment for a house that you have coming up in 6 months, you better make sure you have X dollars in 6 months when, barring any market volatility. So
right.
You just want to make sure that you're investing appropriately on a per goal basis, because just because things are in a rosy situation currently, that might be okay if you see a 20% dip in the market, if you have, like you said, a 35-year time horizon for retirement, right? But if you had a 6-month time window for buying a house and you need that dollar amount for that goal, it's going to completely change what you want to hold in the portfolio.
Right. So balance, diversification. I think that's the main message for today, but that covers a lot of what we needed and wanted to go over in terms of financial planning. And we understand that different goals and different time horizons and different cash flow situations are going to basically require different strategies. And that's where we work one-on-one with clients to make sure that we're identifying strategies, presenting the options, and helping someone make the best financial decision for themselves with those all available to them. So any last words?
Nope, we covered a lot today.
Yeah,
we're good.
Appreciate you tuning in. Let us know if there's any other topics you want us to cover. We've got more coming at you here soon. But as always, definitely make sure to tune in at our next video, and appreciate you being here today. Have a great day.
Thanks for the time. Take care.